A new health secretary begins work following Matt Hancock's resignation for breaching social distancing. Former Chancellor SAJID JAVID says his priority is getting out of the pandemic, and he's honoured to be taking the role.
I also know that it comes with huge responsibility, and I will do everything I can to make sure that I deliver for the people of this great country.
His predecessor's departure came after an affair with his aide and the breaking of rules he made. Labour says the matter is not closed.
There's huge questions still to answer. If anybody thinks that the resignation of Matt Hancock is the end of the issue, I think they're wrong.
We'll be looking at challenges for the new health secretary and for the NHS in England. Also tonight, a serious security breach. How were documents about this Royal Navy warship among those found at a bus stop in Kent? 150 people are still missing after the collapse of a Florida apartment block. 9 bodies have been recovered from the ruins.
Hazard striking from distance, Torgan Hazard!
And Belgium have just knocked out Portugal in the last 16 of the Euros. Good evening. The new Health Secretary, SAJID JAVID, says his immediate priority is to get the country through the pandemic so that life can return to normal as quickly as possible. The former Chancellor was speaking as he returned to government to replace Matt Hancock, who resigned after it emerged he was having an affair with his aide in breach of the guidance that he helped draw up. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, has said there are still questions to answer about the appointment of Gina Coller-D'Angelo and the Prime Minister's judgment. Here's our political correspondent, Ben Wright.
After 18 months away from the cabinet, SAJID JAVID is back, an old hand in a new job. The former Chancellor and Home Secretary arrived at the Department of Health this morning, and the cameras outside were ready.
We are still in a pandemic, and I want to see that come to an end as soon as possible, and that will be my most immediate priority, to see that we can return to normal as soon and as quickly as possible.
Mr. JAVID was appointed quickly following Matt Hancock's resignation last night. On Friday, images were published of him kissing a colleague in his office. By breaking the government's own COVID rules, Mr. Hancock's political credibility was damaged, and his personal authority was tarnished because of the way his affair was exposed. At first, Matt Hancock hoped an apology would be enough to cling on, and Number 10 stuck by him, repeatedly saying that it considered the matter closed. But privately, senior Tories were telling Downing Street and Mr. Hancock that his position was untenable. Labour said Boris Johnson should have sacked his health secretary on Friday.
Matt Hancock was right to resign because he broke the rules. He had to go. But the Prime Minister should have sacked him. Yet again, Boris Johnson was too slow, too weak, and didn't show the leadership that was needed.
And then there's the question of how on earth these images were captured from inside Matt Hancock's private office. Was it CCTV or a hidden camera? Ministers want answers.
Viewers will have seen this morning in some coverage in the press around what people are saying has happened. The Department of Health will be investigating this quite rightly to understand how this was able to happen. Putting aside what's on the pictures, the fact that it was leaked at all.
SAJID JAVID has a daunting in-tray, from dealing with an ongoing pandemic to an NHS under pressure. He will also have a big say over COVID rules and may have a different view to his predecessor.
I don't imagine that actually his caution will be diminished when it comes to the pandemic, but I certainly think his view could be defined as a lot more liberal when it comes to COVID restrictions.
Tomorrow, SAJID JAVID is expected to update MPs on the government's target for lifting all remaining COVID restrictions in England next month. He is a new voice around the table with big decisions to make. Ben Wright, BBC News.
Well, as you heard there, beyond the pandemic, the new Health Secretary's inbox includes other pressures on the NHS in England and the government's ambition for a new social care plan. Here's our health correspondent, Dominic Hughes.
Another day when those over 18 in England are being encouraged to grab a jab. A big push on vaccinations to try and get as many people as possible covered by the 19th of July. The vaccination programme has been one really significant success in the response to the pandemic. And walk-in vaccination centres like this one here in North Manchester have been open all weekend, helping to ensure that at least half of all those under the age of 30 in England have received at least their first dose by the end of today. But progress on vaccinations can't hide some significant problems, most pressing the country's recovery from COVID. The pandemic is far from done. Infections are rising and experts warn there could still be some difficult months ahead.
We've seen the Alpha variant and now we've seen the Delta variant, and how many letters there are in the alphabet, we will see many more. So we have to expect that it will be a bumpy road out and that there will be twists and turns that we're not wishing to see.
No vaccine is 100% effective. Even those who've had 2 doses can still fall ill, only adding to the staff challenges in the NHS. There's a huge backlog of operations and procedures, but the risk of burnout among doctors and nurses is very real. Already understaffed, the NHS now has a workforce struggling to cope.
And many feel devalued, especially when you consider the government's belief that they deserve a 1% pay rise. So I think there's going to be a lot of work that SAJID JAVID will need to do to instill confidence amongst the healthcare workforce to make sure they actually are retained to deliver the care that's going to be needed in this hugely challenging period.
And there are long-term issues too, not least the question of how to fund social care. It's a problem that has plagued governments for the past 2 decades. One former health secretary says without reform of social care, the wider health service will struggle.
Absolutely top of SAJID JAVID's list will be to get a 10-year plan for the social care system to really set it up for the future in the way that the 10-year plan for the NHS did back in 2018.
How long does SAJID JAVID have?
6 months, because the government has said they will do it by the end of this year, and I know SAJID will want to honour that promise.
All this at a time when the NHS in England is looking for a new chief executive. One of the most challenging jobs in politics just got tougher. Dominic Hughes, BBC News.
Let's look then at the latest government figures on coronavirus, which show there have been 14,876 cases and 11 deaths in the latest 24-hour period. However, a technical error meant that some data hasn't been processed, so the true figures are likely to be higher. On average, there were 14,865 new cases per day in the last week. In the last 24 hours, just over 230,000 people received a first vaccine dose. That takes us to more than 44 million people having had their first jab. Close to 200,000 people have just had their second jab, which means nearly 32.5 million people are fully vaccinated, or more than 61% of UK adults. Well, our health editor Hugh Pim is here in the studio now. Hugh, what do you make of the new health secretary, what he's said so far and what he's up against?
Well, Mishal, SAJID JAVID is being plunged right into some really crucial decisions about the handling of the pandemic. Ministers have to decide tomorrow whether there can be any lifting of restrictions from July the 5th. That seems highly unlikely. Then there's the bigger decision about July the 19th, whether the legal lifting of all restrictions can take place. Now, we've had these indications today that he takes a more libertarian view of lockdown than his predecessor. He did say today he wanted to see a return to normal as quickly as possible. Though this evening, aides are guiding us that he will very much look at the data and be briefed by health and medical leaders before leaning one way or the other. But beyond July the 19th, there are really major challenges. There's the possibility of a winter flu outbreak, because flu was almost completely suppressed in the most recent winter, so natural immunity has waned. As we've been hearing, there's this backlog of non-urgent surgery which needs to be dealt with, waiting list of more than 5 million in England, the need to organise a booster jab programme for COVID and the flu jabs. There's the issue of NHS pay, possible row coming up there. And all of this just as the head of NHS England, Sir Simon Stevens, a really experienced leader, is stepping down next month. So we'll have a new head of NHS England and a new health secretary at the same time at a really critical moment for the health service.
Hugh Pim, thank you very much. Classified Ministry of Defence documents, including details about the warship HMS Defender, have been found at a bus stop in Kent. They were discovered by a member of the public who passed them to the BBC. Today, the government acknowledged a serious breach of security, as our diplomatic correspondent Paul Adams reports.
When HMS Defender left the Ukrainian port of Odessa last week, at the start of a journey likely to draw hostile attention from Russia, secret documents about its mission were lying in a soggy heap behind a bus stop in Kent. The documents show that officials were keenly aware that sailing close to the coast of Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014, could cause an incident. What do we understand about the possible welcome party, one of them asked. This map shows two possible routes. The one marked in green would challenge Russia's claims of sovereignty. Possible Russian responses could range from safe and professional to neither safe nor professional. To sail further south could be interpreted by Russia as a sign the UK was being scared and running away.
Hands for action stations, hands for action stations.
HMS Defender took the green route. Russia's response was hostile. This wasn't the point of the exercise, but the documents show that this was hardly unexpected. All that is now in the past, but the papers don't stop there. There's much more.
The range of material is quite alarming because it covers relations with Russia, with HMS Defender. It covers Afghanistan, it covers arms exports, relations with the United States. The level of classification of all this stuff is not all that high, but anything that's classified shouldn't be going outside the MOD, covering this range of issues. One issue perhaps, but not this range of issues. That's pretty sensitive.
NATO is in the middle of withdrawing from Afghanistan. Britain still negotiating with its partners, especially the Americans, about what kind of British military presence might remain. One document makes a number of recommendations with dates, locations and numbers. And there are warnings. Any UK footprint in Afghanistan that persists is assessed to be vulnerable to targeting by a complex network of actors. The government says the loss of documents is now being looked at.
I think it is a serious breach, and the Ministry of Defence, I've spoken to the Defence Secretary, are taking forward an internal investigation into how this happened.
We have 2 suspect aircraft coming in.
Labour says the crew of HMS Defender did their job well last week, but this security lapse shows the government didn't.
I want to see the Defence Secretary complete his investigation urgently, come to the House of Commons this week to reassure the public about what's happened, whether any military operations were put at risk.
This whole episode has been more embarrassing than damaging. Had the material fallen into other hands, officials know it could have been a lot worse. Paul Adams, BBC News.
Let's take a look now at some of the day's other news. And in France, Marine Le Pen's far-right National Rally Party have failed in their bid to win their first ever regional election. Exit polls from the second round runoff votes suggest that its prime target, Provence, was won by the mainstream centre-right party, the Republicans. Tens of thousands of people are continuing to flee the Bangladeshi capital ahead of a strict nationwide lockdown to curb spiralling coronavirus infections. Ferries out of the city have been packed with passengers. The shutdown sparked an exodus, and although it's been pushed back to Thursday, police say the number of migrant workers leaving is growing. In Florida, around 150 people are still unaccounted for 4 days after the collapse of a 12-story apartment block. Officials said that the death toll from the disaster had risen to 9 after 4 more bodies were found in the ruins. The building was in the town of Surfside in Miami-Dade County, a residential complex called Champlain Towers, which crumbled to the ground in just 12 seconds, trapping people inside. Rescuers have been searching the rubble of the 55 apartments using dogs and sonar equipment in the hope of finding survivors. Well, our correspondent Will Grant is live at the scene now. Will.
Mishal, this is now the 4th day since this horrific event, and in that time the families have had absolutely no positive updates whatsoever. There's next to nothing to give them hope, and yet they're holding on to it anyway.
These things aren't supposed to happen in America. The infrastructure of the richest country in the world, in one of its richest cities, is meant to be solid and reliable. But when the 12 stories of Champlain Towers collapsed, almost 160 residents disappeared beneath the rubble in seconds. Only a handful have been found.
As of today, 1 victim passed away in the hospital, and we've recovered 8 more victims on site. So I am confirming today that the death toll is at 9.
Their families can now only pray for a miracle. At the local church, the priest read the list of parishioners missing since the collapse. A quiet seaside community now ripped apart. Yet while hope remains, the families and survivors are clinging to it. One churchgoer's family had a miraculous escape and are struggling to comprehend how their small apartment is still standing.
I have a lot of survivor's guilt on this, you know. Why me and why not my neighbor from 604? She was like a lovely lady, you know, and you know, I saw a picture of her, you know, and you know, I just can't see anybody, you know. I hope to God that they're going to find somebody, but man, you know, if you saw what I saw, nothingness, and then, you know, you go over there and you see, like, you know, all the rubble, how can somebody survive that?
There is little for the families to do but continue to wait for information. Many have said that they do truly believe they could still be reunited with their relatives. Others have now accepted the grim fact that the chances they survived are very slim indeed.
Yesterday it was just so surreal. You know, all this energy of this acceptance and denial, acceptance and loss. But I know that in my heart, they're most probably in heaven now. Would like this Catholic believe that they're in heaven.
As the work goes on, more than 150 people are still to be found. The moment this community fears next is hearing that this has moved from a search and rescue operation to one of search and recovery. Will Grant, BBC News, Miami.
China's space agency has released video of its Zhurong rover moving across the surface of Mars. The pictures were captured by a wireless camera planted on the ground. The rover is investigating vast terrain in the planet's northern hemisphere. Time now to catch up on the sport. It's been an exciting evening of football. Let's join Sarah Mulkerrins at the BBC Sports Centre. Sarah.
Good evening, Mishal. It certainly has, because the top-ranked team in the world, Belgium, are through to the quarter-finals of Euro 2020 after beating holders Portugal this evening. Elsewhere, there was a shock in the early game as Netherlands were dumped out by the Czech Republic, as Adam Wilde now reports.
This is Budapest turned a shade of orange. The Netherlands have so far been one of the tournament's brighter teams, eye-catching performances coloured by a growing confidence. But then a moment to turn a game, to turn a tournament. Dutch defender Matthijs de Ligt couldn't turn quickly enough. A handball which ultimately would end his game. Glorious! The standout moment from a quiet first half. Portugal, of course, wouldn't go without a fight, but still they couldn't quite find the goal they needed to stay. They are out, Cristiano Ronaldo and all. Belgium have never won a major tournament. Now they're becoming the team to beat. Adam Wilde, BBC News.
British number one Johanna Konta is out of Wimbledon after a member of her team tested positive for COVID-19. The 27th seed was deemed a close contact and will now have to isolate for 10 days. She was due to play Katerina Siniakova of the Czech Republic in the first round on Tuesday. England women cruised to an 8-wicket victory against India in the first of their 3 one-day internationals at Bristol. Tammy Beaumont and Nat Siver starred with the bat as they helped chase down 202 to claim the win after a sluggish innings from India. England now lead the multi-format series 4-2 after points were shared from the opening drawn test match. Lewis Hamilton says his Mercedes team would keep pushing as Red Bull's Max Verstappen won the Styrian Grand Prix. That extends his Formula One championship lead to 18 points over Britain's 7-time world champion. Katie Gornell reports.
Lewis Hamilton has turned many a title race into a procession, but not this year. Max Verstappen has made sure of that. The Red Bull driver lined up in Austria 12 points clear of Hamilton in the championship and 8 metres clear on the grid.
It's lights out and away we go.
From the first lap, Verstappen took control. Further back, things were not quite so smooth.
And there's chaos at the back.
Verstappen and Hamilton were now in a race of their own, but even with a 7 times champion on his tail,
so Max expects Hamilton to push.
The 23-year-old never looked flustered. The Dutchman managed to turn 71 laps into a cruise. Behind him in the Mercedes, there was frustration.
What should I do? I can't close that gap.
In front of him, only the checkered flag.
He wins the Styrian Grand Prix.
Hamilton's only consolation, a point for the fastest lap. In the end, there was little Hamilton could do, as the greatest threat to his dominance of Formula One continues to prove he's up to the challenge. Katie Gornall, BBC News.
And as always, you can head to the BBC Sport website for all the news, including how teenager Keely Hodgkinson beat Gemma Reekie and Laura Muir to secure an 800-metre spot at the Tokyo Olympics. But that is it from me, Mishal.
Sarah, thank you very much. A first look at tomorrow morning's newspapers is coming up on the BBC News channel in a moment, but that is it from us for tonight on BBC One. It's time now for the news wherever you are. Good night.